Hi there, and welcome back to Haunting Vales. Tonight's story begins at the Blue Finch Inn, a charming little place on the edge of St. Mary Mead, where travelers come for quiet rest and sometimes never truly leave. Room 7 had always been avoided. Guests complained of whispers, of reflections that didn't quite match their own, until one morning, a woman was found dead, and the mirror in that room was found cracked from the inside. When Miss Marple is called to look into the matter, she discovers that the mirror didn't just reflect faces. It revealed secrets no one wanted seen. Because in Room 7, the past never leaves quietly, and some truths are better left unreflected. Stay with us till the end. And if you love mysteries where every shadow tells a story, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to Haunting Vales. Chapter 1. The Reflection That Shouldn't Be There. It began, as such things often do, on an evening when the rain fell just hard enough to silence the streets of St. Mary Mead. The windows of the Old Swan Inn glowed softly through the mist, their yellow light reflecting on the cobblestones like trembling candles on a pond. Inside, the fire crackled in the grate, the air thick with the scent of wood smoke and wet wool. Guests murmured quietly over their suppers, and the innkeeper, Mrs. Partridge, moved between the tables with her usual mix of briskness and warmth. She was a small woman, round-faced, with eyes that missed nothing. But that night, her usual composure was strained. For upstairs, in Room 7, the room that had been closed for nearly 6 months, there was once again a guest. The name in the register was Mr. Henry Larkin, a quiet man, middle-aged, well-dressed but unremarkable. He had arrived with a single suitcase and asked for supper to be sent up to his room. Nothing unusual, Mrs. Partridge told herself. And yet, something about the man, the way he looked at the staircase before climbing it, unsettled her. She would later tell the constable, "It wasn't that he looked frightened, sir. More like he was preparing himself." At that very hour, across the lane from the inn, Miss Marple sat by her own fire, a ball of blue wool in her lap, and a look of mild concentration on her face. She had heard, as she always did, that Room 7 was finally open again. In St. Mary Mead, no news stayed secret for long. The Old Swan Inn was not the sort of place Miss Marple frequented often, but she remembered the talk from last spring, when a traveling salesman named Mr. Pritchard had been found dead in that very room. A heart attack, the doctor had said. A sad, simple end. Yet even then, Miss Marple had quietly wondered about the strange detail whispered afterward, the cracked mirror on the wall, and how it had been found facing the wrong way. Now, as the wind pressed against her window, she couldn't shake a small feeling of unease, a sense that stories, like mirrors, sometimes reflect what others miss. At the Old Swan, Henry Larkin stood alone in Room 7. It was a modest room, a single bed, a narrow window, and the mirror on the wall opposite the door. The glass was old, a little warped, and split by a thin crack that ran from corner to corner like a lightning strike frozen in time. Larkin set his suitcase on the bed and exhaled heavily. His hands trembled slightly. He walked to the mirror and studied his reflection. For a long while, nothing moved but the flicker of candlelight behind him. Then, faintly, ever so faintly, something in the reflection shifted. The man in the mirror blinked a fraction of a second too late. Larkin stepped back sharply, his breath quick. He looked over his shoulder. Nothing there but the empty room. He turned back to the glass. His reflection was normal again. He rubbed his eyes and let out a nervous laugh. "Just tired," he muttered. "Just the train journey." But the mirror, cracked and quiet, seemed to disagree. Downstairs, Mrs. Partridge poured herself a small glass of sherry, something she only did when unsettled. The clock above the mantel struck 10. At that moment, the front door opened, and a familiar figure entered, shaking rain from her umbrella. "Evening, Mrs. Partridge," Miss Marple said pleasantly. "Dreadful weather, isn't it? Miss Marple, out in this, are you? Oh, I had a small matter to deliver. A church notice for your husband. But I couldn't resist stopping by. There's such warmth in this place." Mrs. Partridge smiled faintly, but her eyes darted toward the ceiling. Miss Marple followed the glance. "You've a guest upstairs, I hear," she said softly. "Yes, room 7. Miss Marple's knitting bag rustled as she set it down. "Ah, that one." Mrs. Partridge hesitated. "You don't believe the talk, surely? The things people said after poor Mr. Pritchard?" Miss Marple tilted her head, her expression one of mild amusement. "Oh, you know how stories are in small villages. They grow like ivy, sometimes clinging to a bit of truth, sometimes not. But tell me, has the mirror been replaced?" Mrs. Partridge blinked. "No, it's the same one. Can't afford new furnishings every time gossip stirs." Miss Marple nodded slowly. "Yes, of course. Still, old mirrors do have a way of holding on to memories." Her eyes drifted briefly toward the ceiling again, as if she could see through it, into room 7, and the man who now sat motionless before the cracked glass. That night, the inn fell quiet. The rain turned to mist, and the road outside disappeared under fog. At 11:30, a sound echoed faintly through the corridor, a dull thud like a chair tipping over. Then silence. Mrs. Partridge, half asleep in her bed, frowned. She thought she dreamed it. But then came another sound, 3 soft knocks on her door. She rose, wrapped her shawl tightly, and opened it. No one was there. Only the long corridor stretched before her, dimly lit by a single oil lamp. The carpet was damp, as though someone had passed by dripping water. Heart beating faster, she climbed the stairs. As she reached room 7, she noticed the door was ajar. "Mr. Larkin," she called. "Is everything all right?" No answer. She pushed the door open slowly. The candle inside had burned nearly to the end. The room smelled faintly of metal. Mr. Larkin sat in the chair before the mirror, his face pale, his eyes open, staring directly into the cracked glass. For a terrible moment, Mrs. Partridge thought he was alive. Then she saw the stillness, the unnatural calm of death. And in the mirror, the reflection did not match. The man in the glass was smiling. By morning, the inn was buzzing with fear. The constable came, questions were asked, statements taken. The doctor once again declared a heart failure, natural causes, the same as before. But when Miss Marple arrived that afternoon, politely inquiring after Mrs. Partridge's health, she noticed the faint tremor in the woman's hands. "It's happened again, hasn't it?" Miss Marple said softly. Mrs. Partridge nodded. "Yes, and this time, I saw it, or thought I did." Miss Marple leaned forward. "What exactly did you see?" The innkeeper's voice shook. "When I went in, he was already gone. But his reflection, I swear to you, Miss Marple, it wasn't right. It smiled at me, as if it knew." Miss Marple said nothing for a moment. Then she rose, her expression thoughtful. "Would you be so kind as to show me the room?" Room 7 looked perfectly ordinary in the daylight. The small window, the narrow bed, the cracked mirror catching the pale winter sun. Miss Marple walked slowly around it, her gloved fingers tracing the air, not touching but observing. "Two deaths, both in this room," she murmured. "Both said to be heart attacks. And the same mirror, the same reflection." She crouched slightly, peering at the base of the mirror frame. Her sharp eyes caught something faint, a small, dark stain on the lower edge of the wood. She said softly. "Rushed, or blood, perhaps. Hard to tell after all this time." Mrs. Partridge watched nervously. "You don't think it's cursed, do you, Miss Marple?" "Cursed?" Miss Marple gave a small, almost mischievous smile. "No, my dear, but I do think someone wanted it to appear that way. Fear can be a very useful disguise." She turned toward the window. "From here, One could just see the reflection of the street outside, the path leading toward the churchyard. And in that faint reflection, a shadow moved, someone watching from below. Miss Marple's eyes narrowed. It seems we have an audience. That evening, Miss Marple took a seat in the inn's parlor, pretending to knit. The mirror upstairs continued to glint faintly through the half-open door. The guests whispered about curses and ghosts, but she listened not to words, only footsteps. At precisely 8 o'clock, she heard them, quiet, measured, coming up the stairs. Someone stopped outside room 7. The door creaked. Miss Marple rose silently and stepped into the corridor. The figure froze, a tall man in a dark coat, startled. "Oh," he said, recovering himself. "You frightened me." "Quite understandable," Miss Marple said gently. "It's a frightening place, isn't it? Though I dare say you know that already." The man blinked. I'm Mr. Ellis, the late Mr. Larkin's employer. I came to collect his belongings." "Ah," said Miss Marple, studying him carefully. "And you chose to come after dark?" He hesitated. "I travel by train. The last one from London was delayed." Miss Marple nodded, her knitting needles clicking softly in her hands. "Well then, Mr. Ellis, perhaps you'll allow me to accompany you. I'm rather curious about this mirror everyone's so afraid of." His face tightened. "I don't see why you should." But Miss Marple was already moving past him. "Oh, nonsense. Ghosts rarely appear to company." In room 7, the air felt colder. The candlelight quivered. Miss Marple stood before the mirror, her eyes calm and unblinking. "Strange," she said lightly. "When one looks closely, one can see the smallest details. For instance, the thin wire, almost invisible, running along the crack in the glass." Mr. Ellis stiffened. "Quite. Yes," Miss Marple continued. "And behind it, a very faint residue. A chemical, perhaps, something that could be heated. When it is, the person standing before the mirror might feel faint, dizzy, as though struck by fear itself. A clever trick." Mr. Ellis took a step back. "You can't prove that." "Oh, but I don't need to," Miss Marple said kindly. "I imagine the police will, once I suggest they examine the wall behind this mirror. I suspect they'll find a small apparatus, one used to release fumes. Just enough to stop a weak heart." His face went pale. "You?" Miss Marple smiled faintly. "Oh, I'm just a silly old woman who knits and listens. But I do know when a mirror shows more than just a reflection." For a moment, neither moved. Then, from somewhere outside, a clock struck 9. The sound seemed to shatter the silence. Mr. Ellis suddenly turned, bolting for the door. But Mrs. Partridge, who had been waiting on Miss Marple's quiet instruction, stepped into the corridor with the constable at her side. Mr. Ellis froze. The truth, at last, had come to light, in the reflection of a cracked mirror. Miss Marple returned home late that night. The rain had stopped, and the moon glowed softly over St. Mary Mead. She hung her shawl, made her tea, and sat by the fire once more. Her knitting lay untouched. Instead, she looked into her small mirror on the mantel, her own reflection gazing back with quiet amusement. "People do so love to see what they want in mirrors," she murmured. "But sometimes what they see looking back is themselves." The fire crackled gently. Outside, the village slept, unaware that yet another shadow had passed and been seen clearly by one pair of sharp blue eyes. Chapter 2. The Truth Behind the Glass. The morning after Mr. Ellis's arrest dawned cold and silver gray over St. Mary Mead. Mist rolled through the hedgerows, the air heavy with the smell of damp earth and distant rain. The Old Swan Inn stood silent, its windows shuttered as if trying to forget what had happened inside. Yet news in a village travels faster than weather. By breakfast time, the story had spread. How Miss Marple, that gentle old lady with her knitting and sharp eyes, had uncovered murder hidden behind a cracked mirror. But Miss Marple herself said very little. She never liked to gloat, and besides, something about it still bothered her. It was all too neat, too clean. Inspector Cray arrived from the county police later that morning. A broad, red-faced man with a stiff collar and an even stiffer skepticism about village detectives. He greeted Miss Marple with polite courtesy and mild disbelief. "I must say, madam," he said, flipping through his notebook, "you seem to have quite the talent for finding trouble." Miss Marple smiled faintly. "Oh, Inspector, I assure you, trouble finds me. I simply try to tidy up after it." He snorted, not unkindly. "You claim this fellow Ellis built some contraption behind the mirror, a device to release gas. A stretch, don't you think?" "Not at all," Miss Marple replied softly. "He was a chemist by trade. The late Mr. Larkin worked for him, and the first man who died, Mr. Pritchard, sold glass and mirror fittings. I dare say the connections are rather more than coincidence." Cray pursed his lips. "Still, no proof yet." Miss Marple nodded. "Which is why, Inspector, we ought to look behind the glass." By late afternoon, workmen had been called to remove the mirror from the wall of room 7. Miss Marple stood quietly in the corner as they pried the frame loose. Dust floated in the air like old secrets being shaken free. Then, a small clatter. A piece of thin copper tubing fell to the floor. The inspector's brow lifted. Well now, behind the mirror was a shallow cavity in the wall, no larger than a shoebox. Inside it sat a small canister with a valve, a battery connection, and a switch cleverly disguised in the lower molding of the mirror frame. Inspector Cray whistled softly. "You were right." Miss Marple's expression didn't change. Someone went to great trouble to make death look natural. Twice. He turned to her. "But why? Larkin's dead. Ellis is in custody. What's the motive?" "Greed, perhaps. Or fear," Miss Marple said gently. "But I suspect there's still one more person who knows the full story." That evening, Miss Marple paid another visit to the inn. Mrs. Partridge, pale and exhausted, was sitting by the fire, hands clasped tightly around a cup of tea. "It's terrible," she said. "To think such wickedness happened right here. I keep hearing that sound, the thud in the night, the knock at my door." Miss Marple sat beside her. "You've had a dreadful shock. But if it's any comfort, I don't think the worst is over yet." Mrs. Partridge looked up, startled. "Not over?" "No," Miss Marple said softly. "Because I believe Ellis wasn't working alone." The innkeeper's face drained of color. "You mean someone else helped him?" Miss Marple nodded. "There's something that doesn't quite fit. You see, Ellis came to the inn after Larkin's death to collect his belongings. But how did he know Larkin had died? There had been no announcement. The police hadn't even finished their report. Someone must have sent word." Mrs. Partridge swallowed hard. "You think someone here told him?" "I think," Miss Marple said, "that whoever moved the furniture back into place after each death knew precisely what they were hiding." Her voice was calm, but her eyes, usually so mild, shone like steel. Late that night, the wind began again, a hollow moan slipping through the cracks of the inn. Miss Marple, staying the night for her peace of mind, took the small guest room across the hall from room 7. At midnight, she heard movement, quiet, deliberate. A door creaked open. Miss Marple rose silently, wrapped her shawl, and peered through the crack of her own door. A shadow moved down the corridor, a figure holding a lantern, stepping lightly toward room 7. "Mrs. Partridge." Miss Marple's voice, soft but steady, broke the silence. "You'll catch your death in this draught, Mrs. Partridge." The woman froze, the lantern trembling in her hand. "Miss Marple, you frightened me half to death." "I rather think that's what you were about to do yourself," Miss Marple said, stepping into the hall. Mrs. Partridge's face went ashen. I don't know what you mean." "Oh, I think you do," Miss Marple replied gently. "You've been playing both sides, haven't you? You let Ellis install that device in the wall, and when Mr. Larkin returned, perhaps threatening to expose him, you made sure the mirror was ready to work its trick again. Mrs. Partridge's lips trembled. You can't prove anything. Miss Marple's voice remained calm, almost kind. You were the only one with keys to every room. The only one who could have switched on that hidden valve. You told the constable you heard a sound at 11:30, but that was when you were standing outside his door, wasn't it? The lantern shook harder. He made me do it, she whispered. Ellis. He said he'd ruin us, my husband, the inn, if I didn't help. I thought it was only to frighten him. I didn't know he'd die. Miss Marple sighed softly. I dare say you told yourself that. People often do. She nodded toward the far end of the corridor, where Inspector Cray now stepped into view, having heard every word. Mrs. Partridge sank into a chair, covering her face. By morning, the Old Swan Inn was once again empty, except for the silence that always follows truth. Inspector Cray, for all his skepticism, was almost humble as he stood beside Miss Marple on the front steps. Well, he said, seems you were right again. Ellis for the device, and Mrs. Partridge for the helping hand. You've a gift for seeing straight through people. Miss Marple smiled faintly. Oh, not a gift, Inspector. Merely observation. Mirrors and people are alike. Both reflect what's put before them. But it's remarkable how often one forgets to clean the glass. He chuckled softly. You make it sound so simple. It usually is, she said. Once you stop looking for ghosts and start looking for guilt. For a week, St. Mary Mead settled into uneasy quiet. Life resumed, as it always did, though the talk lingered. The cursed mirror, the wicked chemist, the innkeeper's betrayal. But gossip like smoke eventually fades. Miss Marple tended her garden, attended the vicar's tea, and knitted a pair of socks for her nephew. All seemed well, until one evening, when a small brown envelope arrived at her door. It was addressed in unfamiliar handwriting. Inside was a folded piece of paper and a photograph. The photograph showed room 7, the mirror on the wall, but the reflection was wrong again. In the image, though the room was empty, a woman's face could be seen faintly in the glass, pale, smiling, watching. And beneath the photograph, a note. You stopped the living, Miss Marple, but can you stop the dead? Miss Marple's teacup trembled slightly as she set it down, not from fear, but from something deeper, the calm certainty that this story was not yet finished. She stood, walked to her window, and looked out toward the faint lights of the Old Swan Inn in the distance. The fog had returned, curling low over the fields. Somewhere in that mist, room 7 waited. And Miss Marple, who had seen too many endings to mistake them for conclusions, whispered softly to herself, Then we shall see what truth remains behind glass. Chapter 3. The Face in the Mirror. For several days after the envelope arrived, Miss Marple went about her routine as if nothing at all were amiss. She tended her rose bushes, exchanged polite words with neighbors, and visited the vicarage for tea. Yet beneath her calm exterior, her thoughts turned again and again to the photograph, that strange image of room 7, and the smiling woman reflected in the cracked glass. Miss Marple had no talent for superstition. She believed in human motives, not in hauntings. But she also knew that guilt, when left to fester, could take the shape of ghosts, not from beyond, but from within. So when evening fell, and the village lamps flickered to life one by one, she wrapped her shawl tightly around her shoulders and set out for the Old Swan Inn once more. The inn looked deserted. A pale light glowed in the downstairs parlor, where dust still hung in the air like the aftermath of whispered sin. Mrs. Partridge had been taken away to the county jail 2 nights earlier. Her husband, poor man, had shuttered the windows and refused to speak to anyone. Miss Marple knocked softly. After a pause, the door opened, revealing Mr. Partridge's hollow, sleepless eyes. Miss Marple, he said in a voice that seemed to have lost its strength. You shouldn't be here. It's cursed. Everyone says so. Curses, Miss Marple said kindly, are for people who prefer mystery to truth. But truth, Mr. Partridge, is the only thing that ever sets a place free. He swallowed hard. Then you'd best come in. Inside, the inn felt colder than the night outside. The scent of dust and wood polish lingered, as though time itself had stopped moving. Miss Marple walked quietly through the corridor, her eyes resting on the staircase that led to room 7. The air seemed heavier there, not with ghosts, but with memory. "Have the police taken the mirror away?" she asked. Mr. Partridge shook his head. "No, ma'am. They said it was evidence, but they left it till morning." "Good," Miss Marple said softly. "Then perhaps we can still see what it is left to tell." The room was just as she remembered it, narrow, dim, with a faint scent of candle wax and damp linen. The cracked mirror hung crooked on the wall, its glass reflecting the flicker of a single lantern. Miss Marple stepped closer, her reflection wavering like water. For a moment, she simply stood there, her calm eyes studying the split down the middle of the glass. "You know," she said gently, "people have always feared mirrors. They say they can trap the soul, hold what the eye cannot see. But truly, it is the mind that traps such things." Mr. Partridge stood by the door, his hands twisting nervously. "I don't want to look at it," he said hoarsely. "I keep seeing her there. My wife. Every time the light hits it, I see her face." Miss Marple's tone softened. "That is because you love her, Mr. Partridge. And love does not vanish, even when it's mixed with guilt." He shook his head, covering his face. "I should have stopped her. I knew something was wrong. Ellis came and went, and I never asked why. She said it was business, and I believed her." Miss Marple looked once more into the mirror. "Then perhaps the mirror doesn't show her," she said quietly. "Perhaps it shows you." At that moment, the lantern flickered. The light dimmed, then steadied again, and both of them saw it. A faint shape in the glass. A woman's outline. Her eyes closed, her smile distant and strange. Mr. Partridge gasped and stumbled back. "There! You saw it too." Miss Marple's expression did not change. "Yes," she said softly. "I saw it. But not because it is there, because you believe it to be. Mirrors are cruel things, Mr. Partridge. They do not lie, but they reflect our fears back at us." She turned to the side, noticing something faint on the glass, a smudge circular near the bottom edge. She leaned closer. "Ah," she murmured, "not a ghost at all, but a print. A fingerprint, clear as daylight." She smiled faintly. "And that, I believe, does not belong to your wife." By the following morning, Miss Marple's discovery had once again sent the police hurrying. The print on the mirror did not match Mrs. Partridge nor Mr. Ellis. It belonged to someone entirely different, a man named Thomas Bell, the former caretaker who had left the inn months before the first death. He had disappeared without notice, claiming work in another town. But when Inspector Cray sent word, they learned no such man had ever been employed there. He used a false name, the inspector said grimly, and if I'm not mistaken, the canister and tubing we found were ordered under his hand. He set it all up before leaving. Ellis and Mrs. Partridge only carried on what he began. Miss Marple nodded. "Quite so. And now he's hiding, though I expect not for long. When one builds a trap for others, one usually forgets to step clear of it oneself." She paused. "Have you checked the well behind the inn?" Cray blinked. "The well? Yes," Miss Marple said quietly. "There's always one nearby, in old inns. Mr. Bell was not the sort to travel far. He'd want to watch the results of his handiwork. Some men do. An hour later, they found him. His body lay at the bottom of the old stone well, barely visible through the water. He had fallen, or perhaps been pushed, weeks ago. The damp air preserved little but the outline of a man who had thought himself clever. That evening, when all was finally finished, Miss Marple stood again outside the Old Swan. The fog was lifting, the moon pale and thin above the roofline. Inspector Cray approached her, his face solemn. "It's done. The inn's closing for good. The partridges will never return." "I dare say that's best," Miss Marple said. "Some walls remember too much." He nodded, hesitated, then added, "I still don't know how you guessed the well." Miss Marple smiled. "Not guessed, Inspector. I simply remembered. The damp on Mrs. Partridge's shoes that first night. The smell of wet earth that didn't match the rain. It was always there, like a reflection, if one cared to look." Cray let out a breath. "You make everything sound so simple." "It's only simple once it's understood," she replied softly. Later, at home in her small sitting room, Miss Marple set the photograph of room 7 upon her mantel. The smiling woman was still faintly visible, though now, Miss Marple thought, the expression seemed gentler. She took up her knitting, the needles clicking quietly in the firelight. Her friend, Mrs. Bantry, dropped by for a cup of tea. "My dear Jane," she said, "I heard all about the mirror business. Quite dreadful. Do you think it was haunted?" Miss Marple's eyes twinkled. "No, my dear. Merely human. The most haunting thing in this world has always been the human heart." Mrs. Bantry shuddered slightly. "Well, I shan't be staying at inns any time soon." Miss Marple smiled, pouring her tea. "Then you'll be safe enough." As the evening drew quiet, Miss Marple sat alone once more, her thoughts drifting like the smoke curling above her fire. She looked in her own small mirror, round, uncracked, perfectly ordinary, and said softly, "It's never the mirror that frightens us, only the truth we see looking back." Her reflection smiled faintly, a kind smile, lined with years and wisdom. Outside, the wind brushed through the trees. The rain had ended, the world peaceful again. And in the silence that followed, one could almost imagine the sound of the Old Swan's door closing for the last time, the past sealing itself away, like a story finally told. Miss Marple placed her knitting aside and leaned closer to the fire. Her voice, calm and knowing, seemed to echo across time. Wherever there is deceit, there will be reflection. And sometimes, all it takes to see it clearly is one small light, and the courage to look. If you enjoyed this mystery, my dear listener, perhaps you care to stay a little longer. There are always more secrets in the quiet corners of the village, and Miss Marple has a way of finding them. Like this video, subscribe to the channel, and join us again soon for another story of shadows, secrets, and truth reflected through the eyes of Miss Marple.